Fantastic. Well, first off, welcome everybody. Thanks for having back-to-back evening meetings as part of this ad hoc process. It's much appreciated. We appreciate your time and your wisdom and your guidance, and understand that these evening meetings sometimes are difficult. And when we have two and sometimes three in the same week, makes it for a challenging week. So anyway, thank you. We appreciate your time. I've just got a few quick kind of opening remarks, and one of them is that, hey folks, this is a public meeting. We are conducting it via Zoom because of the COVID pandemic and complying with Governor Brown's stay home, save lives order. This is the first of possibly two subcommittee meetings for independent investigation and prosecution. And most of you are aware that the model that has worked pretty well for the other subcommittees is that the first meeting is a chance to toss some ideas around, ask questions of the content expert. And we have Police Auditor Mark Gissner with us tonight. Thank you, Police Auditor, for your time this evening. Tonight, after the subcommittee has asked the police auditor all the questions that they wish to ask and have all the information that they need, then Mark Gissner is going to go about his evening and leave the meeting. So just a heads up on that. So the first meeting is this kind of discussion and, coming up with possible recommendations. And then if a second meeting is needed, that's where we put a kind of a fine a point as possible on the recommendations. In the information packet that I sent out, I included the links to the pre-recorded presentations that we had on this topic. And you might recall that was from EPD Sergeant Jason Barrett, Deputy Police Auditor Leah Pitcher, and Lane County District Attorney Patty Perlow. Those links are available in your information packet if you want to review those videos at any time. I also included a table that is a summary of all of the independent investigation and prosecution recommendations that come out of Campaign Zero and 21st Century Policing. There are 13 of them. 3 of them are included in the current EPD policy, which means 10 are not. So you may want to refer to that table as we go through tonight's meeting. Kaz is not able to join us tonight. He is continuing to deal and attend to a family emergency. And finally, a quick reminder, we have 3 large ad hoc committee meetings remaining. We have one on March 2nd, we have one on March 17th, and we have the final meeting on March 31st. As we consider the recommendations this evening, I'd ask that you keep in mind the 3-question format that is also demonstrated to be useful, especially for council members who will be taking these recommendations forward. And the 3 questions are, what is the issue that the community is experiencing and which communities are impacted the most? The second question is, what is specifically your recommendation? And number 3, how do you think the recommendation will address the problem? All right, folks, we've got Jeremy handling kind of the back Zoom room. Thank you, Jeremy. And with that, I will turn it over to the subcommittee. Thanks again, everyone, for being here. Daniel, do you want to start off?
Yeah. Let me just preface this by saying that I came into this ad hoc committee process not really knowing all that much about the process of the police auditor's office or the CRB, or much about police reform for that matter. And so I've been I've been on a steep learning curve and trying to wrap my head around this. I'm a software developer, so it kind of helps me to have a process flow diagram to help visualize this. So I sent some flow diagrams to Kevin this morning, and he so if you could share that first one.
So that would be the current Eugene flowchart. Is that correct?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
And for
Yep.
simplicity, I was trying to just focus on run-of-the-mill complaints. So not community interest cases or lethal use of force cases, something that would be a civilian coming in and complaining, maybe, for example, that an officer used a racial epithet on the job or something like that. So that's trying to keep this very simple. So do we?
Yeah. So of course now I'm having a little bit of clunkiness finding those things, but here we go. The current Eugene. Okay. Got that. Okay. Is everyone able to see that?
It's wonderful. Thank you, Daniel. I'm a visual person, and this is so much better.
Yeah. So I went through the protocols for the police auditor and the CRB, and I'm hoping I got this right. So I'm hoping maybe Mr. Dissner, we can walk through this and you can tell me where I might have got this wrong. The colors are what I identified as what seemed to me to be the four major areas of authority, which is green for classifying, blue for investigation, yellow for adjudication, which is making the final finding, and then red for deciding on the disciplinary action. And then I have two sections. On the left is the police auditor and CRB, and then on the right is EPD, which includes internal affairs and chief of police.
Can I say that this is remarkably well done? And I imagine it took you a lot less than it would take me, but I'm certain it still took you a lot of time to get this done correctly and so easily understood. I just have one question. There's an arrow from the yellow box, police chief final adjudication, and it goes to the viewing right. And is it true that the CRB reviews the case after the police chief has his final adjudication?
Yes, except in the case of community impact cases.
I see. Thank you, Mark. I had that backwards.
And I think the other thing, it's probably a missing piece when it says assigned to investigator and then investigation completed. We participate in the investigation before it's completed. So we are part of the interview of the officers, relevant witnesses, review of the videos, body cameras, which have been such a blessing. All the CAD reports, any of the kind of communications that would be relevant. And in actuality, so the arrow between the upper right-hand white box assigned to investigator down to investigation completed. We're on that arrow as well in terms of what we do. And I think even under the terms, when we get a complaint, which many of them are internally generated either by myself or a supervisor. In a lot of the cases, we actually now review the body worn cameras even before it's classified, because that's obviously a tremendous help in making that decision to classify.
Okay.
But
So would it be fair to have, say, coming off of the complaint or the classified box and a blue box for investigation by your office that would happen in parallel with the IA investigation?
well, I guess the first word is oversee, but that's kind of, that simplifies it a little bit too much, because again, we put probably 99% of the interviews with officers, we're also in there interviewing. State law allows for 2 interviewers maximum. So but we also still oversee it. In other words, our expectation is that they do most of the transactional work, getting the recordings, getting the dates assigned for when the officers interviewed, sending out notifications to the officers. They do most of the transactional work. And we don't normally review like body worn camera video in tandem with them. What we do in tandem with them is the officer interviews, and also then during the course of that investigation, before we decide that it's complete or not, also what our expectations are during the course of the investigation. I can give a good example actually, as today is, there was officers were responding to a major incident, and the driver of one of the police vehicles was not driving according to policy. And so we opened that case. That was actually identified by a supervisor. When I watched the video of the in-car video, there was another police vehicle in front of that vehicle doing the same thing, running red lights without clearing intersections and things like that. So we also then I contacted them saying I needed to know who that driver, because we have to put an allegation for that one too. So that's sort of how the process rolls through. I'm not sure if there's an arrow where it says auditor oversees and defines expectations and participates in officer interviews during the process, if there's a place for that in your diagram. But that's what happens.
Okay. Okay, thank you for that clarification. And let's see, so in the police auditor may contract external investigation, under what circumstances would that happen? How is that external investigator found? And can you just explain that process a little more?
Well, what may happen in that circumstance is, okay, I've been doing this since 1986, basically, so I've been doing it for 34 years. There's been 2 areas, not counting allegations of criminal misconduct. Those the police department will first talk to our district attorney, and then what typically occurs is if there seems some basis for doing a criminal investigation will normally farm that out to another police agency to avoid any appearance of a conflict. The other thing where I may need one, and I almost needed one, where expertise in forensic analysis. In other words, if there was a death in custody, that was under consideration until we determined that it wasn't, in fact, Eugene Police Department that was responsible for that. So then I withdrew that. And then the other area where they've been used, a rather notorious case from a few years ago, was in, we contracted out for human resources type investigation regarding allegations of sexual harassment. And in fact, I think when we decided it should be an external investigation, that actually was also, that was through the city's law department as well. So when those things happen, that is typically what occurs. So if we contract out, in other words, it's going to be an area in which there's a certain expertise that is necessary. I had a few cases back in Cincinnati with deaths in which we contracted out for pathologists and forensics experts.
Okay. Let's see. That light yellow box in the middle, police auditor may recommend adjudication in conference with EPD supervisor. That happens some of the time, which is part of why I shaded it a light yellow, in that it seemed to be part of the adjudication process, but it was a recommendation rather than the final decision.
What occurred? Oh, I'm sorry.
That's why it's light yellow, but that happens. So my question is, that happens sometimes, and under what cases?
Okay, so once the investigation's completed, it's signed, because one of the things I think that people don't understand is, and that's why I was a little surprised on the video at one point in time where Scott McKee said when he was in internal investigations that they made decisions. At least as far as I know, at least going back to when our office opened, internal investigation is just a fact finder. They do not determine whether the officer committed a policy violation or not. So once they do the fact finding, we bless it, if you will, that it's complete and we worked on the case. Then it goes to that officer's direct supervisor. The direct supervisor is responsible for contacting our office to discuss whether the case was sustained, which means policy violation, insufficient evidence, within policy, or unfounded. We consult with that direct supervisor. They write their adjudication recommendation and push it up to through the chain of command to lieutenant, captain, deputy chief, chief, all for their review. We write a separate adjudication recommendation that we then send to the chief after we've met with the direct supervisor. I would say for sworn personnel, uniformed personnel, that occurs probably about 95% of the time, if not more. For non-sworn personnel, probably about 80% of the time. So like someone in dispatch or something like that. But in almost every case, because we have about average 25 to 30 allegations of misconduct every year. And so I would even more than 95%, there might be one where we don't write an adjudication recommendation, but again, that would be unlikely as well.
Okay. Anything else moving down the chart?
Well, the other thing, what I would add is, so at times, so then what the chief gets into the yellow, when you get into the yellow box, they have our adjudication recommendation. They have the direct supervisor adjudication recommendation, and that's typically a sergeant. And then a lieutenant may or may not write an additional adjudication recommendation, less than 50% of the time, I would say. And then the captain can write an adjudication recommendation, which again probably occurs rarely, not often. And then the deputy chief might write one as well, rarely. So in their grouping, and I don't want to speak for them necessarily, in their grouping, at each level, they are at liberty to write their own adjudication recommendation. But most often they will concur with the supervisor. It typically occurs when they don't agree with that first level supervisor. We had a case recently where the sergeant thought the officer acted within policy. The lieutenant thought the officer acted within policy, but the captain wrote a memo disagreeing with the two below him and saying that he thought that the officer violated policy. And then the chief concurred with the captain's recommendation.
Okay.
I also, and I think something that sometimes people don't understand is the city manager is the hiring authority for the city of Eugene. She may designate the chief to make the final decision. That may be her designee, but in terms of, for lack of a better term, constitutional structure, the city manager is the final authority on saying someone violated policy or in adjudications and in terms of discipline. And so I don't know if that's relevant for the general public or not, but that is an important piece. Here, the city manager delegates that responsibility to all the department directors.
Okay. Anything else you see on here that is amiss or that you'd like to comment on? And then I've been taking up a lot of time on that. I'll open it up to other questions before I get into my next part.
No, I think it's very good and succinct. I would modify minorly just a few things, but thanks for providing that. I think it'll be helpful.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, folks, any questions or comments before we move on to the next flow chart?
If I may, and I don't know how this works out, if there's an allegation of criminal misconduct, that will go first, and then it will likely come back then as an administrative investigation that you've outlined in your chart. Your chart speaks specifically to an administrative investigation.
Yes, I was trying to keep it simple.
Yeah.
Any comments or questions? Okay, Daniel, what's the next chart you'd like me to bring up?
The next one is, now I don't know, are you familiar with the Albuquerque police oversight model?
A little bit. I know the consultants who worked on that. If you put it up there, I can refresh.
Yeah.
I did some work in Albuquerque back in the day to help them with their models, but I know after the consent decree that there were probably changes made. So I'm not exactly familiar with what those changes were.
Okay. Yeah, I got this by linking through the NACOL website. And I thought it was interesting because it's a rather similar model, but there are a few key differences that I was hoping I might get your thoughts and comments on. So if you
Okay,
You're going to pull that up?
Kevin.
I am. How's that?
Okay, so this is what I gleaned from the Albuquerque model, and it was nice because they actually had a flow chart on their Civilian Police Oversight Agency website. So I just took it and simplified this. So I guess that blue box on the left side assigned to investigator is kind of a little like what you had said where, and you said it could also come before the classification as well for that investigation.
I'm not sure, because I think what I had discussed earlier, assigned to investigator, investigation completed. What do you know what the role of that investigator on the left side in blue? Do they just also monitor the IA case, or do they do an entirely separate investigation?
No, my understanding is, from what I read, is that they do a separate investigation. They have access to all of the police records, just as our police auditor's office does, but that they have investigators who are on their Civilian Police Oversight Agency staff, which would be analogous to our police auditor's office. And so it is then assigned to an investigator, and that investigation runs in parallel to the internal affairs investigation.
It's similar to the model we had in Cincinnati. So in Cincinnati, there is a separate office that conducts parallel investigations with internal affairs. What then occurs is that then the Citizen Complaint Authority in Cincinnati sends their investigation to the city manager. IA sends their investigation to the chief, who sends it to the city manager. And if there's a disagreement of findings, then the city manager makes the final decision. So we had independent investigators. It was called the Office of Municipal Investigations. Now it's called the Citizens Complaint Authority. The cross part of it, like it's like doing interviews. So like we would conduct an interview of the officer, and internal affairs would conduct an interview of the officer. So there was far less crisscross of the investigations, other than getting the information that we asked for from internal affairs. And I think we also reviewed their reports, and I think we had informal discussions, but there were parallel investigations in Cincinnati, as it would appear in Albuquerque. I was just confused by your white box between the two in the review of the investigation. And we also made disciplinary recommendations. I'm thinking we had a lot more high profile cases in Cincinnati, a lot more officer involved shootings. So I made recommendations in terms of discipline as well as finding.
Yeah, and I'd say that that white box is not really so much a review as just taking both investigations and compiling them before the CPOA recommends finding and discipline. Now, they actually also recommend discipline, which I know also does not happen.
Yeah, I used to do that in Cincinnati, and also, at least in Cincinnati, I don't know about here, is internal affairs also made disciplinary also made finding recommendations. So whereas in Eugene, internal affairs is just fact finders, in Cincinnati, internal affairs also said, yes, this officer violated policy or didn't violate policy. So it's an easier one for me to follow along, because I think part of the direction is whether there should be independent investigators who are not part of the police department.
Do you have any thoughts on that point?
I've worked both ways. I think that I'm always a top-down person. In other words, I want to hold the leadership accountable for the behavior of officers, and not just sort of, and bottom feed is not the right, but in other words, instead of always going after the person who's lowest on the table of organization, is to have the responsibility bared by the chief and the leadership of the department, with us still having that degree of control to oversee that. One of the, I guess, analogies I was thinking of is like the chairman of General Motors doesn't go down to the accounting department to try to find things that are wrong. The chairman of the board of General Motors goes to the CEO of the organization with what the expectations are to hold employees below them accountable. And so a transactional model of oversight, you're always going after individual officers, but you're never really changing the culture of the leadership. And so one of the issues that we had was, of course, there was a cost of dual paths, certainly. And I do like the fact that the police department does all the transactional work, as opposed to us doing the transactional work, scheduling officers for interviews, getting all the information, and that internal investigations is also getting on the other side of their investigation, doing transcripts of interviews, writing reports, all that transactional work. I would rather tell them what my expectations are in the transactional work than doing the transactional work, and making sure that the transactional work is done to our satisfaction, as opposed to me doing it myself. So that part of it, I do, I like that better. But that's also in concert with the powers and duties that the charter and the ordinance have given us to do that. And because we have tremendous penetration to be able to do that. A lot of agencies don't have that degree of penetration to do those kinds of things. That forces the chief to cooperate. So in some agencies, I would say it's better to have that because of the lack of assistance, if you will, from senior command and police chiefs. I think Seattle's a good example of that, where there just always seems to be pushback every time the independent agencies in Seattle try to get information, or in King County in Washington, there's always that pushback. So to have someone do all the transactional work, I find, given our structure, I find to be much better than us having to do that and sending officer notifications and getting them on the schedule and those kinds of things. And writing the reports, because that's a arduous process, and having a transcriber transcribe all the interviews and things like that. So from that aspect, yes, now certainly that there might be that appearance, because again, my office, my position has a tremendous amount of power in terms of making decisions. Unilaterally, I'm the only one that gets to make those decisions, from budget to how many employees I have, and the degree of penetration I have. But if you couple that with the lack of public records access in Oregon, it makes it difficult, because there is that trust component, as opposed to like in Ohio, people get to see everything. If it's not a criminal case, people get to see every aspect of an administrative investigation. Names, rank, serial number, how many disciplines they've had, all those things. That doesn't exist here. So I can certainly understand why there would be that issue.
Okay.
But I've worked at both models for over a decade, so I like somebody else doing the transactional work. I'm not,
Do you think that anything could potentially get lost, and how would you know that there might not be any uh, how would you look for potential bias in that 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 transactional investigation? That
Well,
might,
in all honesty, it's not unusual for me or Leah to ask the tough questions. I think they're better at it than they used to be, because there's still that what's the right word? Collegiality.
Yeah.
That exists. That you still have to, you work out in the same place. You share the same locker rooms. But I think it's a little easier in the IA here because they don't have to make that adjudication decision. They're just the fact finders. Can they hide anything? No, we know where everything is. We know exactly what we want and what our expectations are. But it's true that and often it's not the right word. Moderately, we're asking the tough questions, and normally we try to meet with the IA investigators like these are the questions that we want answered. And one example I can give you is when someone says something like if you ask an officer, did you see Officer A punch the suspect in the face? And the officer says, well, I don't recall. Well, I don't recall is a meaningless statement. It's either like it happened and you saw it, or it could have happened and I don't remember, or it didn't happen. And so there is those little nuances in which you would then have to say, look, could it have happened and you didn't see it? That sort of thing. Those little nuances. And then, in the shooting investigations, of course, those are done by IDFIT, and that's just a whole nother issue for me altogether. But in terms of, and we had penetration in Cincinnati as well in terms of all these kinds of things. And I don't think there's anybody in the country that has as much penetration into a police department as we do at EPD. Now, Albuquerque, I don't know what level of cooperation you get from the chief to cooperate with the oversight agency.
okay. Two more differences that I found. One is that in Albuquerque, the Police Oversight Board, which is analogous to our CRB, reviews the case before it goes on to the police chief for final adjudication. And then the Police Oversight Board could modify the recommendation from the Police Oversight Agency. The second difference is that if the police chief does a final ruling on the adjudication and or discipline that differs from the recommendations given to it, within 30 days, the police chief has to send a letter of explanation explaining why he or she decided differently.
And what we had in Cincinnati was very similar to that, in that if the case went to the review board and they had a recommendation that was different, then the city manager would make the final decision. So at least in Cincinnati, and I don't know about the case of Albuquerque, the city manager was very much involved in both the adjudication process and the disciplinary process as the hiring authority for the city. So that's one of the differences. I noted here. Here they have designees.
Do you have any thoughts on the upsides or downsides of the Eugene model versus this type of model?
I think it my personal opinion, again, given the authority that Leah and I have as auditor and deputy auditor, the investigation piece, again, I'm fine with them doing the transactional work. I think it would be help build trust in the community if the CRB was able to make an adjudication recommendation and make an adjudication recommendation before the chief made a final decision. I don't see any harm in that. The only hiccup to that would be they couldn't do it on every case just because of volume. You couldn't give, I have over 10 years, I have 465 pages of every case that we've done in the last 10 years, including service complaints and policy complaints, but there's 465 pages of tiny font. But of the cases that they decide to review, I think it would build trust if they could make their recommendation beforehand. And I also think I'm sorry, Mike, Brian, I'll finish here. I don't see the harm in them seeing discipline and commenting on discipline. But currently contractually with the union, that's not an element that can occur. But I don't see where that is a problem. And studies have shown actually that they're typically far more lenient in that area. Review boards are far more lenient than police chiefs are in terms of reviewing and commenting on discipline.
Okay. That's all I had. I don't want to take up any more time from other questions that other subcommittee members might have. Thank you very much.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks for all your hard work on those models.
Okay, questions or comments regarding the flow charts? Any questions for Police Auditor Gissner? Okay. Then it would be appropriate at this point in the meeting.
Erica has her hand up.
Thanks, Daniel. Erica, go ahead.
So I wanted to talk a little bit of the video that was sent.
The video of Scott McKee.
Mhm.
Okay.
Because you know, in the video there is a lot of important information that is pointed out about the culture within organizational cultures. And you know, we know that every organization has a culture. There is a way that the procedures are carried. There is a criteria that is followed. You know, there is like priorities. So I wanted to point out that, you know, according to the video, you know, he points out about police culture, and he talks about how, you know, within this organization specifically, there exists a subtle leverage. There is a presumption of influence, and you know, there is this assumption that, you know, is we the police force against them, you know. So I just wanted to kind of reflect a little bit in there, because you know, when this in the video, this information is said from the experience of this person that has been involved in, I think it's 35 years. So I just, you know, I just feel that part of this work is, you know, humanizing the police and humanizing, you know, us, referring to Indigenous, Black, and people of color. because, if there is, this is already existing, and it's not just within the organization as the police force, but as public force. And historically speaking, there have never been good relationships between the police force and indigenous, Black, and people of color, right? Because, that was the main role of the public force, a continual genocidal of indigenous peoples, control of people that were in slavery. So, so understanding this and being from then to now, we see that these power relations are still happening. Within civil society, it happens a lot. Within the school system, it's happening. The fact that there is still teachers that refuse or don't find ways of including Black History Month within the teaching, So all these ways of resistance, and it's all these relations of power. So it would be not, it would be like being too idealistic to believe that this doesn't exist in the police force. So understanding this, I'm very curious in how, we can better these systems, because it's obviously there is one part that is missing, and I just feel that part of the part is missing is accountability, right? And I just feel that that is something that is not focused in the accountability on, for example, in cases of cases of specific police officers that have a record of different situations, right? Or different things. So what do you think about this? How can we avoid that this subtle leverage, this position of influence, because, we are all in the same group, and at the end of the day, we're all going back to work, right? So how, where we can find that balance?
Well, I think, and I know Scott very well. He wasn't in internal affairs when I first came here. I certainly understand his perspective. There was not an auditor's office when he was in internal affairs. And at times I do completely understand his perspective. I've said probably more times than I can count to the mayor, for example, until Oregon opens the books on administrative investigations, they will never gain the trust of the community. If you think of a few of the high profile cases that occurred, and I'm thinking, and I forget his name because I'm getting old, the 12-year-old boy that was shot in Cleveland, when no one criticized the investigation because everything was an open book. They might have criticized how the officer was fired or not fired, or the decisions that were made, but in terms of the actual investigation, anyone in the community could see that investigation and make their own decision. They always had 100% of the information. Here in Eugene, as Lindsay Foltz has said often, there's only 11 people who bear witness to these case files outside of the police department. The 4 people in my office and the 7 people on the review board. So you only have, and other than Brian has probably seen a few cases, only Rick Rosette and Lindsay Foltz have both seen about 30 to 50 investigations, entire investigations of cases. So it's 2021, this just trust us, narrative that comes out of the state of Oregon laws, it just doesn't fit society anymore. And until that happens, I think that there'll always be that mistrust of processes. And then I think if we do a better job of training and recruitment and having a more diverse workforce, that is more reflective of these needs, then I think that that will go a long way as well. But I don't disagree with you that oftentimes people of color and even people not of color are initially marginalized at that first 5 to 10 or 15 seconds, then they would marginalize one of their own colleagues.
Thank you, Mark. Erica, did that address your question?
Thank you.
Wonderful.
You're welcome.
Mark, thanks for your time and your candid answers. Really appreciate it. Any other questions or comments for Mark before we let him go about the rest of his evening?
I can talk about this for hours, so no worries. Thank you. Thanks for your time and for volunteering to do all this very difficult work. I know it's very difficult work, and again, the state of Oregon makes it even more difficult. So unfortunately, thank you.
So I have a I have a comment, like I want to go back to this this dehumanization, because if you really think, when we think about the cases that happen where people lost their loved ones in the police, within the hands of police force, like when we think about these kind of cases, and we think about like that most of the time for the police to not be implicated, or like to not be found guilty, like the media helps in the dehumanization of the people that had been murdered, right? So and I think that is something that is very important to mention within this, because I feel media, especially locally, I feel that has a lot of power, and media and police force goes together, because in the cases where people have lost their lives, media have helped dehumanizing. So, for the police not to get in trouble, we had to dehumanize the people that had been murdered, whether it was a mistake, whether it was a bad practice, let's call it bad practice, um, there is a further dehumanization of the people, the victims. But also, I just feel that because of these cases, there is a further dehumanization of the police force too. Because the police dehumanize us, and also we dehumanize them. And then it's like, how can we build from this further, dehumanization, mutual dehumanization, because I just feel that that sometimes having a person like a person that justifies in a certain way, or having a person that says, oh, police did everything they could, that was the best solution they could have taken at that moment, they fear for their life, the person was was wearing dark clothes, the person was big, and of color, and these are like kind of like the excuses that have been used to justify the and dehumanize members of our community. So what do you think about this? I'm specific talking about Charlie Landeros and Eliborio Rodriguez cases.
I think that's one of the, and I agree with you. I think, and we've changed that here, and I don't think it has happened after the Rodriguez cases. One of the things that always really troubled me was that a chief or a district attorney would immediately start talking about the criminal record of the person who was either injured or killed. none of which was known by the officer at the time that the contact occurred. But again, it's that immediate spin to try to dehumanize, as you said, this person into a bad person. Um, that has, we've been very adamant about that's not relevant and you shouldn't talk about it. And I don't think Chief Skinner talks about that anymore. And I don't think our district attorney talks about that anymore. And that's just one step of many. But yes, as part of the narrative to justify the behavior, it is not unusual nationwide to talk about what this person's past was. A good example, Walter Brown from Ferguson, Missouri. They repeatedly showed the robbery that was committed a half hour before, but it had no relevance to that officer's use of deadly force because the officer knew nothing about that. And so, again, it was a way to spin and marginalize and dehumanize Walter Brown rather than just start talking about the facts of the case. And it's still a steep hill to climb, but I know, we've been adamant about the relevancy of things that the officer knew at the time and the lack of relevancy of all those things that have occurred in the past, whatever might have occurred in the past. So I agree with you. There's nationally that narrative continues in terms of dehumanizing a person who's been killed.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Erica, for asking that question. All right, the timekeeper on my shoulder notes that it is 7 o'clock. We're halfway through our meeting tonight. I would suggest at this point, if we are completed with Mr. Gissner, that we allow him to go about his evening. And thank you, Mark, very much. Appreciate your time and your direct answers.
Yeah, anything I can do to help. I'm a temp now for 7 more days, so I can kind of say whatever I want to say. At the same time, I want Eugene to still, do well in this process. And I appreciate the community accepting me for all these years. Thank you so much.
I am sharing into the chat a link for the fundraising for the wife of Eliborio Rodriguez, who has 4 children that were orphaned, after Eliborio was killed. So if you can help me sharing, because, that is part also building community, lifting up the people that have been hurt by the people that is supposed to protect us.
Thank you, Erica.
Thank you, Erica.
Okay, Mark.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks.
Well,
Yep.
Thank you. And but he's gone.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Mark.
he is gone. That was very much appreciated to have him here. Okay. So we have an hour left. I know Daniel has prepared another couple flow charts that will be a topic of conversation. So we have that. Brian Michaels has proposed 2 motions, and I think that he would like to speak to those. So how would you like to proceed?
I've taken up.
We've seen 2 flow charts. Do we need to see 4?
Well, I guess in a way, because the flowcharts kind of relate to 2 possible models. One based on the proposal, which I had submitted testimony to the full committee a few weeks ago, and then a possible alternative model to that. One of the things that struck me about the current Eugene process is that if we're looking for something that's balanced in terms of community oversight, most everything I noticed is on the right side, which is with it under the the EPD column, in that the majority of the investigation, the adjudication, and the discipline all lie under there, whereas the Albuquerque model had a little bit more balance, but not a whole lot. And so,
How about this? Why don't you send us the other two flow charts and we'll discuss them at the next meeting?
I could do
My
that.
money, Erica was the only one who asked Mark any question I wanted to hear the answer to. And so I'm not optimistic about the next two flow charts occupying the rest of this meeting. So why don't you just send them to us and we will look at them and discuss them at the next meeting?
I can do that. I mean, part of it was discussing one of the conversations I was hoping to have here was discussing conceptually where we how we can provide stronger community oversight at specific steps in the process, and to be able to see that visually before crafting emotions around that. And I thought it might be helpful, but I'm happy to defer that for you to go over your emotions first, if you like. I just think it might be germane to the conversation.
So
Well,
how about
it wasn't
this?
so much my emotions. I think that I would like to hear from other people in the group here about how they see and want input into the oversight and, I'm sorry, the investigation and prosecution. Frankly, I'm not really sure what prosecution means in this context, because this committee has no authority over the Lane County. But I think we want to hear from everyone how they want to see. We have a CRB oversight investigation model with the matrix that you, Daniel, raised and brought to our attention early in these meetings. And I think it's a real good one. I think everyone here, and speak up and tell me I'm wrong, wants the investigation to come away from the police and put into the hands of citizens, as well as the conclusion of that investigation into the hands of citizens and away from the police. I'm not that interested, maybe other people are, in what Albuquerque does. I know Marty came up with several cities who have what I view better models than Albuquerque, because the power rests in the citizens, not ultimately in the police. And so I would prefer, and you all tell me if you agree, that we spend the rest of this meeting talking about what we would like to see happen in terms of how the civilians investigate complaints by the police. Erica has spoken up, and in my view, this committee is more slanted toward hearing from her and her comments, as well as from anyone else who has similar comments about their vision of the citizen oversight and investigation of police misconduct. And so my motions are my motions, but I really don't take any of this personal. So none of my remarks are in some way competitive that I talk rather than you talk. It's not in my nature, and it's never what I intend to express.
Yeah.
I just felt we spent an hour on these things, and I don't want to spend another hour on them.
Well, I just thought it would help me to visualize, to have a visual representation of what it is that we're discussing, because I think makes it, for me at least, easier to see where the key points are that we want to address with our motions in the process. But
well, drawing up those flow charts, what you did a very highly professional job. Just email them to us. We'll review them, and we'll also have the similar, better understanding of how the system works by looking at the flow chart.
Sorry to
How about
interrupt.
this, folks?
Sorry to interrupt, but
Let me hang on just a sec, Erica. I'm going to step in here as a facilitator and suggest that we do open up the conversation to a more general what this committee would like to see happen in terms of independent investigations. And we might have time, by looking at the clock, I do believe we will have time to take a look at the two motions that Brian has put forward. And Daniel, I will take care of emailing the flowcharts to the subcommittee. I'll do that this evening, and then we can address those at the next subcommittee meeting. If that's acceptable, let's try it. Don't hear anyone saying that's a bad idea.
Oh, I think it's a grand
I
idea.
think,
And
well,
Eric was about to talk, so I didn't say anything.
yes, well, so what I think is that, I am a visual person, and it really helped me to see the flow chart that Daniel had put time on it. So I feel that instead of like arguing whether we should do it or not, I think we should maybe take advantage that Daniel is here. And if you, Daniel, can you please speed it up your presentation so we can get to see the flow charts. You can get to show us how you map it out, and because I feel like that will help me
Okay.
and to be more productive in my observations too. Because if I have any question, any questions regarding what your work, you are here, and I will ask that, and that will help me understand that. Because honestly, like I'm also learning how this system works. So I am not going to say I'm a professional, and if you took the time, I would really appreciate it, being able to see them, at least for me.
Okay,
Right.
thank
Thanks,
you. Yeah.
Erica.
Yeah, I think I can go through both of these flowcharts pretty quickly in about 5 minutes, just to explain what my thinking on them are, and to tie them into specific Campaign Zero recommendations.
Okay. Ems, any thoughts? I'd like to check in with you.
I think that if it's not a big deal to just look at the flow charts, it shouldn't take that long. And then we could, if we have any quick questions, we could do it. And if we need to look more, they could always get shared on through the email.
Okay. All right. Well, Daniel, let me share the screen.
Okay.
And let's aim for 5 minutes, shall we?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
So if we look
which
at
one would you like?
the proposed.
Proposed. You got it.
Yeah. And so in this, we actually follow the model where there is a full investigation under the community side, police auditor CRB. The difference here is that the office is under the authority of the CRB, because the CRB reviews the case and makes the final adjudication based on the investigations, both internal and external. In this model, we actually have a true external investigative body, which is in the police auditor office staff, which is assigned to the CRB to support the CRB and under the authority of the CRB. The police chief reviews the final adjudication by the CRB and then decides discipline from the pre-negotiated matrix. as an alternative model, and this is, if you can click on the alternative tab. This is a little bit different. It kind of is a hybrid of the proposed model and a beefed up model. Currently, the Campaign Zero recommendations which are involved in here is that it gives the CRB power to make disciplinary and policy recommendations to the police chief. In this case, though, just it's the adjudication, which is a recommendation. The police chief can make the finding, but then it if so, the second Campaign Zero recommendation to compel the police chief to explain why they have not followed a recommendation, and then to give the CRB power to decide cases where the police chief does not follow recommendations. But again, the discipline is meted out according to a pre-negotiated matrix. The difference here between the alternative and the proposed is that the police chief can take the recommendation of the CRB or not. If he doesn't, he has to explain why, and then the CRB can overrule that disagreement.
I have a question on
Yes.
this. Yeah. So let's say you said police chief final finding. Since police chief is not investigating, what would that finding be? Because the police chief is not investigating, it's coming from CRB.
Yeah, well, a suggestion, in this alternative case, the CRB suggests, recommends an adjudication, which the police chief can accept or decide or disagree with. If he disagrees with it, he needs to explain why. So there's, rather than just always having to accept the CRB, there's more of a back and forth.
So it's more like a review instead of finding, because everything he will be getting will be coming from the CRB and with a recommendation, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay. And what would happen if it goes back to the police chief disagree and send a letter of explanation?
Then the CRB could read that and go, oh, this makes sense. We'll agree with the disagreement, or we will possibly overrule it and stick to its original recommendation for adjudication.
And in that case, since the recommendation is not coming from from the police chief, and the police chief does not agree with the recommendation, but who's going to decide on the discipline?
The discipline will still be decided by the pre-negotiated matrix.
Police chief, even if they don't agree with the finding?
Even if they don't, if the CRB overrules the police chief's disagreement, then the CRB's adjudication will stand.
Okay, I will yield for now for further discussion later, because I think that's gonna be a little conflictual for Eugene. I don't know why I kept saying Eugene police. For the police chief to discipline someone based on things that he or she did not agree with. Like if I don't think there is, I have to discipline someone based on the information you provided me. If you overrule, it's not even overruling, it's disagree with my finding or review or my determination, coming back to me to discipline the same person, I think that may be a little problematic. I'm just looking at it in a very practical ways, things that may go forward and kind of be a problem. Is what will happen is CRV send it back to the police chief for discipline, and the police chief does not agree with it and does not discipline the officer. What would happen then? We're gonna have a situation where there is the CRB is recommending discipline, the police chief is not following the CRB recommendation, so therefore there won't be any discipline because there is no way for CRB to force the police chief into disciplining someone. And I agree that it's with the model. I think it's just the decision making about the discipline that maybe in this case, if it has to be resolved, maybe giving the CRB the authority to take a disciplinary action. I don't know how we do that, or that would take completely the police chief off the picture, because regardless of what the decision is, they may make a recommendation to the CRB for the CRB to take to decide on the disciplinary action. That I think we can talk about it later, and it would be great if you send it to all the groups. So next time we'll probably see. I'll probably be more prepared to share my my point of view with the group. But I again, like anyone else, I want to thank you for doing this. It's really it's easy to follow. It's easy to understand. It makes sense.
Thank you, Ibrahim.
Thank you. I'm sorry I got booted out of the meeting somehow, but I'm back.
Daniel, I'm hearing a high level of appreciation for the work that you did, and it was very helpful to provide a visual chart because these systems are complex. So I know it was helpful for me. Thank you. Brian, I can sense just by looking at you that you would like to say something.
It's this light behind me, and it makes me look like I want to say something.
Okay.
But you know, I'll certainly say something. But I didn't mean to project that. Look, as I said before, I mean, the amount of work you put into this and the flow chart and the color coordination, it can't be overstated how good a job you did. As you know from discussions we've had, and I think it's similar to what Ibrahim just said, when you boil it all down, you're not really changing anything. The CRB reviews somebody else's investigation, and the police chief makes the ultimate decision. And if we're going to get anything changed, then maybe people don't agree with this, but in my view, the investigation needs to be conducted, supervised, and concluded by citizens. I don't know why you want to have two investigations, one from the police auditor and one by the Civilian Review Board. It seems we can streamline it, that the complaints go through the the police auditor, get referred and cataloged into the CRB, and the CRB does one single investigation. It seems two investigations are unnecessary. And double expenses. I'm not sure why you wanted to do that. But all this is in the motions I propose, and I don't mean to talk about myself, but this is something you and I have discussed quite a bit. So I'm not telling you anything new. I'm just expressing my view to those people who aren't privy to our conversation. I would like to see a flow chart. I don't know how to make one. With just see what that looks like. Complaints go into the police auditor. Investigation is done by the CRB. The conclusion of the CRB is plugged into the matrix, and discipline is imposed in accordance with this a matrix. It has a lot less moving parts, but ultimately the power resides in the citizens who make up the Citizen Review Board. Any process, no matter how many things, how many movements there are, ultimately, like we have right now, the police chief gets to make the final decision, and that's dangerous. That's what brings us where we are. That's why nobody gets disciplined. That's why the police chief, after Rodriguez was murdered, came out within days exonerating the officer who did it, and said he wants his officers to stop people who don't look like they belong where they are. My God, you want that guy making the decisions on police discipline? That's insane. It's racist, to say the least. So that would be my comment.
Thank you, Brian.
Yeah.
I think if Police Auditor Gissner were here, he might push back a bit on your statement that no one gets disciplined, because I don't think that's the case. Ems, let me check in with you again here, please. Thoughts, comments? I want to make sure that we are paying attention to you.
Yep, I'm just taking it all in. I really appreciate those the effort that went on those and that work, and I think that I feel like we're getting. I'm just gonna say that. Anyways, I don't have much to say. I'm taking it all in, and I'm just listening to the conversation and making some thoughts and processes for later on.
I appreciate that, and thank you for being here. I'm wondering at this point if it wouldn't be helpful for me to refer to the Campaign Zero and 21st Century policing recommendations. There are 2 in that spreadsheet that are not currently included in Eugene Police policy, and I'm wondering, and they're short, I can read them, but it may help propel the conversation here this evening. I'm happy to do that.
I think so too. And if you could just also share that really quick for those folks that might want a visual, that'll be great. Thank you.
Sure. I'm thinking that perhaps, yeah, that's probably the easiest thing for me to do. I can do that. I'm not highly skilled at this, so it'll take me a moment. And then, Brian, I do want to let you know that let's leave time here to take a look at those 2 motions and have the subcommittee have a conversation about those, okay?
While you're sharing that, Kevin, might I respond to Brian?
Yep, yeah, please.
Brian and I have had these conversations before, and so Mike, he and I don't disagree on the high level concepts, but the details I think we do. First, as far as having 2 investigations, I think internal affairs investigations are going to happen one way or another. That internal affairs is not going to go away, and there are also EPD has its own internal processes that would require IA investigations. I think they'd happen anyway. To me, the question is...
No, I agree with that. The 2 investigations I was referring to is one by the police auditor and one by CRB.
Okay,
Not-
yeah, and this is the other point is that the CRB is composed of citizens such as ourselves who apply to be on the Civilian Review Board. I do not see that 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 board members would have either the training or the time to do all of that grunt work of investigation, that they would need to have staff assigned to them to do that work, and staff who are under their authority to do that work. Would you disagree
Yes.
with that, Brian?
Yes,
So
and
whether
so I would take the investigators from the police auditor and put them under the authority and supervision of CRB. We don't need two investigative teams.
Right. No, I completely agree with that. And under my model, I'm still calling that the police auditor's office. Even and I believe I stated that it would that the police auditor's office would be under the authority of this and under the direction of the CRB. Whether you call it the police auditor's office or call it the CRB office, to me is just in a name. Our current police auditor's office has all of the infrastructure that ties in to EPD records, and so I'm just calling it the police auditor's office, but it still would be, as in your model, under the authority of the CRB. So I don't think we're as different as it might seem.
Thank you, Daniel. All right,
Okay.
let me
All right, thank
share
you.
this. Okay. So we are talking about two recommendations here, line items 161 and 162. The first one says law enforcement agency leadership should examine opportunities to incorporate procedural justice into the internal discipline process, placing additional importance on values adherence rather than adherence to rules. Union leadership should be partners in this process. Number 162 reads, research conducted to evaluate the effectiveness of crime-fighting strategies should specifically look at the potential for collateral damage of any given strategy on community trust and legitimacy. Those are the only two recommendations that are currently not in EPD's policy. And I thought it was worthwhile to bring that to your attention. Well, don't all talk at once. I was trying to be helpful.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I was.
No, I mean, I
No,
think
you
they're
are.
both. I think they're both good ideas, and that we should work those into motions.
Okay. Thanks, Daniel. I was dying there. Okay. And that may be an appropriate activity between now and our second subcommittee meeting, right?
Yes, can you send that sheet you just showed us to us all?
Yes, I can, Brian. I'll resend it. It was included in the information packet that you received for this meeting, and I'm happy to resend it.
Oh, it was? Okay, then.
Yeah,
anyway,
it was
fine.
on
I
the
didn't
second
realize-
page, and it's kind of small font, but I'll resend it.
Thanks.
Yep. Okay. Well, Mr. Michaels, how about if I share the text of the two motions that you sent earlier today?
Sure.
All right. Okay, Kevin, there we go. I'm assuming that everyone can see those clearly.
Yep.
Okay, cool. The first one reads just so if there are folks tuning in that may not be able to see this, just let me read them quickly, and then Brian, I'll have you speak to those. The first one is all investigations into complaints about police officers other than IA, internal affairs, must be conducted, supervised, and concluded by citizens of the CRB, along with the discipline matrix raised in previous motions. The second one is investigators now in the police auditor office will become part of the CRB instead. And I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to drop those into the chat. And Brian, if you can speak to the first one.
Sure. I think it's part of the discussion we've pretty much had up till now, since Mark left, about how the process can work. In my view and my experience dealing with these issues, even Mark acknowledged that I've been around a while and probably saw more than most of these complaints go through the process. To me, it's just a failure. There's no real other way to put it. You know, they killed Rodriguez, they killed Brian Babbs, they beat the heck out of my client, they beat Sarah's kid, and nothing happened. These officers remain officers. And it's because the police are policing the police. And ultimately, the final arbiter of facts has to be citizens. And it's not a very complicated process until you want to make it seem, and I'm not saying Daniel was doing this at all, but until one wants to, which is what they've done with the process now, create a lot of little moving parts to make it seem like something else is going on other than the police chief is making the final decision. But ultimately, the police chief is making the final decision. Whether it's not the police auditor or it's not the citizens, it doesn't really matter much to me. What matters to me is that a diverse representation of the Eugene community makes the decision whether police conduct was out of line or appropriate. And that's why there's not a whole lot of moving parts in my, I can't do a flow chart like Daniel. I don't have that artistic technical ability. And but really it would have a whole lot less boxes. It would have about half the boxes. And so that's really what I'm trying to say here is, and it requires a lot of other movement. There's been a lot of motions that came out of the Civilian Oversight Committee, which me and Daniel were on together, giving the CRB a lot of investigative tools to accomplish this final result, which is that a diverse representation of our community decides whether police conduct was appropriate or out of line. I actually don't have my video on because of this light behind me. It's kind of distracting, I would think, but I'm not trying to hide myself. Just look at that. So I'm just going to turn it off. And that's all this thing is trying to accomplish. We are the investigative subcommittee, so we can make that motion happen. We can table it for next week and discuss it then. If you want to review it, think about it, email about it between now and our next meeting. However you want to do it is fine. But that's the explanation for it.
Okay, Brian, thank you. Well, I would suggest the subcommittee consider, let's talk about that first one. If someone wanted to move that, Brian, if you wanted to move that, if we got a second, we could go into discussion and then the subcommittee could vote tonight on that.
I wanted I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
So
Ems.
I don't think I'm ready to vote on any of them, just because I will be curious on to see what other folks have to say if they come up with their own motions, because they might be similar, or they might be build on those motions. I like it, Brian. I am not. I do agree that the police cannot police themselves. It's like, it's a problem, really, and it breaks trust in the community. I don't know if the internal investigations, like someone said before, will go away, because it might have some sort of value to keep it within the police. So if someone wants to vote, I could vote, but I will prefer to wait till next meeting to see if some people who will build on these motions and chat about it, or and see what comes out of it.
Thank you, Ems. Ibrahim, what's your feeling on this?
Yeah, I'm here. So I would recommend that we table it until the next meeting.
Okay. Erica, what are you thinking about this?
I think that that I can definitely wait till listen other ideas, but I definitely also think that, you know, because of precedents, I don't think I'm really like convinced that police should police themselves. I also think that I believe in the community oversight. I think that having people from different segments of the civil society involved in the investigations will help to have more culturally competent decisions, especially when there is a pattern of behavior of people, and also I feel that um, like if we do a whole investigation as community regarding a case, and then the chief on police have that authority to say, well, I disagree. So then that people doesn't, there is open a door of lack of transparency in there, because if the community, if we go back to the roots of this, this is here, like the police is supposedly to serve and protect, right? So and if we go back to that core, and we need to be sure that the community that they are serving and protecting are happy and are feeling like they are doing their job, right? Because right now, like, because of the precedents that happened before, that's why we are here, because it's not working. And we need more people involved. We need more, this is just going to make us better as a community. Because, I also feel like that as the police have so much responsibilities in the shoulders, and they also need to be supported, because, like, they are no robots either. They are human people that also have, that after being exposed to so many things, they also need, and they have also, we as community, we also owe them, we also owe them in the fact that they are serving. So we need to be sure that they are in the right mental health to be doing their job, right? So if we see that one of the people that are there out to serve and protect is not, is not being supported, and is not having that, that mental health they need, they are not going to be doing their jobs. So as a community, that is also our job. You need to be sure that every member that is serving and protecting us has a good mental health, so they can do a good job. because they are also part of the community, and I think that is also that is another perspective that I see, right? Because like having other eyes is not going to hurt anybody. It's just going to help us become better people, become a better community that is safe for everybody. So I feel that the more people can get involved within this investigation, and the more like diversified people are involved, I think is going to help us to see those things that we cannot see, right? Because like my experience and the things I see and the things I feel are different of what the things you're seeing and feeling, and we are exactly in the same room and we're listening the same things, right? But what have happened in our past is what have shaped us, and that's why, like, I'm not saying that some were good and some better. You were a product of the environment we were born, and then understanding that we had to re-educate, we had to unlearn things so we can learn good things, so we can move forward as good people, as a community. I feel that is where I am. I feel that having a community to oversight this is not like, oh, we want to cut them. I think it's more like, okay, where is those things that we can help? Because they can, it's not humanly possible that the police does everything, that they attend all the calls, right? So we have to start seeing, like, a little bit of marketing research, right? Like, we need to see, okay, what are those patterns of behavior? What are those things that someone else can be taking care? So we know that for mental health care, we know that Cahus is doing a good job. So what are the other areas that we can help the police to pick up? Maybe by creating other organizations that are going to be doing that. So we leave those responsibilities from the police in a way that we humanize the police too. And they also become back to be members of the communities, because right now it's not like they are part of the community, because it's like, no, Blue Lives Matter, and they are a sole group that is not part of the community. So I think that is the part that we need to focus. We need to focus in how we as people for the community, we want to have more representatives of the community to represent and to support the police and to support our community ourselves. So I feel like even if the chief of police might not agree with the community is saying, but you're here to serve and protect, and the community is saying this, and if you're not listening, well, then we need a new chief.
Okay, thank you for those comments, Erica and Daniel. I see your hand is up, so you have the floor.
Thank you. Yeah, Erica, you bring up really excellent points, especially around police culture, that that I think that in many cases, people go into policing with the best of intentions, but once they're in, that culture changes them. A culture which trains them to solve a problem predominantly with force, and a culture of protecting their own, and of seeing members of the community not as cherished human beings to be protected, but as potential threats. To me, the only way to shift that culture is through holding them accountable for when they violate the public's trust. My son, he's 21. He hangs out with his friends downtown. They all know who the bad cops are. They know, and they can name them. How can we set up a structure of oversight and accountability where we can hold bad actors accountable and get them out of the force? There are some professions where one bad apple does indeed spoil the whole bunch. I don't think any of us would tolerate an airline pilot, one bad airline pilot among thousands who's a bad actor. I don't think we would tolerate that. And because those people have our lives in their hands. And I think it's the same with police officers, that we need to find a way to hold them accountable and get them out. And that will shift the culture when police officers know they're being watched, know they're being held accountable, and know that they could lose their jobs if they cause harm to the people that they are entrusted to protect. I would like to see some motions around around how to deal with officers with multiple complaints. I would also yeah, I'll say that. And there was one other thing, and it just flew out of my head. Yeah, so I'll leave that there.
Okay, thanks, Daniel. That happens to me quite often. Goes right off the tracks. All right, we've got about 10 minutes left. I do want to leave about 5 minutes at the end of our meeting for next steps. I've been writing down some of the things that I need to do. Daniel, yes.
I remembered what it was.
Good.
Also, I'd like to see a motion that directly addresses what Mark Gissner was talking about state law and administrative. I think that the public needs to know that police are being held accountable when they are. While there might be HR privacy rules around around knowing what a specific disciplinary action was, I think that's part of the idea behind the matrix, that the public will at least know a range in which it is. But the public should know, if I file a complaint, I should know, there should be complete transparency in that process, and I should be able to know whether or not that police officer was found, whether the allegation in my complaint was sustained, and if not, why not? And to know that there was some discipline within the range of the matrix that was meted out.
That is a statement. Mark's right. Between the union and the state law, that's a huge hill to climb. I'd rather the guy or a woman, whatever, was disciplined and nobody knew about it and fired, like the guy who murdered Rodriguez or the guy who murdered Babs. I'd rather they were fired and we didn't know about it than they weren't fired at all. I don't know that we can take on in this subcommittee and in this ad hoc committee that Mount Everest of an issue.
Well, I don't think that there's anything that prevents us from calling it out in the report and from making a recommendation that we would like to see this addressed in the range of state law. And I would like to see that.
Absolutely, I agree.
Yeah. Ems, I see your hands. Hand is up.
That was my question. I was going to ask Daniel that you don't necessarily have to share right now for the sake of time, but you could always email us on how will it be targeted. Like if it makes a recommendation that the city of Virginia starts a petition to the state legislation, or like how will you be like that to word it? That's just something that came through my head, because again, I agree that this is not stopping us from making this is not stopping us from making oh my god, it's escaping my head, sorry, I have a long day.
Recommendation.
Yeah, the recommendations. Thank you, Erica. This is not stopping us from making recommendations to the city, which is what we're here for. So thank you.
That is absolutely correct. Okay, I've been writing some things down of things that I need to do to get information to you, and And then I've got some suggestions to follow up on what you've just said about kind of homework, for lack of a better term. That's the professor and teacher in me coming out. The things that I have written down that I need to do soon is to send the flow charts that Daniel prepared. I'll send those to the subcommittee. I'll send I'll resend the spreadsheet with the Campaign Zero and 21st Century Policing items on there. One thing we haven't talked about, but it's one thing that I will do, and that is I will send a doodle poll out to you so that we can nail down the second meeting as quickly as we can, because as you know, the time is becoming short, and we have a March 31st deadline that is coming up fast. So I will get that doodle poll out tomorrow to you, and I ask that you do your best to fill that out so that we can find a date for the second meeting. Was there anything else that you need me to do for you? Okay. Well, if you think of something,
Can we email each other? Can we have each other's email so that we can discuss these issues from between meetings?
yeah, Brian, sort of. So there are 5 people in this subcommittee, and the way I understand public meetings law is that 2 of you can have conversations at any one time. If there are 3 or more, that will consist there. That will create a quorum, which would then trigger the requirement for a public meeting. So we're kind of having to navigate that really narrow line, and I apologize for that. It makes it really difficult for you to have conversations in between meetings, but we can't do it because this is a public process, and the public has the right to be aware of any deliberations.
I get that. I'm just wondering if we can be trusted to do a one-on-one. If I want to email Ems and Ems wants to email me, we can have a chat. And we'll all be aware that there should never be a third person in that email. Is that something that we could do?
Well, that's something I will check on for sure tomorrow and let you know.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you bet. Anything else?
Yes,
That,
I have a question. Mark Gessner talked about the video sent in by Scott McKee. Erica also talked about it. And I think a lot of people in the subcommittee, in the committee, have learned something about how the internal investigation goes. What's the mindset? Is it possible for us to have like 10 to 15 minute spot for Scott to come and answer questions?
oh, at the next subcommittee meeting?
I'm talking about it here because the internal affairs investigation and this will be to pertain to the subcommittee.
I second that motion.
Wait, I didn't know that was a motion.
We call it a request, but I guess that's a motion.
Sure. Well, let's make that official then. I think that would be an appropriate thing to do, Ibrahim, if you want to move that.
Yeah, I'll move it to a motion for the ad hoc committee to invite Scott McKee to talk about his experience as an internal affairs investigator.
Okay, so I got you, Brian, but I want to make sure that I'm clear. We're talking about this subcommittee, not the entire ad hoc committee.
I would prefer that he come to the ad hoc committee. Can we?
So this subcommittee really doesn't have the authority to direct that. That would have to come from the larger committee.
But what we could do is move to have him come to our committee, and B,
Yes.
make a motion that we can present to the entire committee that he comes to the entire committee.
You could certainly do that. Yes.
Okay. So is there an interest for people here to have Scott to come to this subcommittee meeting?
Okay. I'm going to type that in there in the chat. Daniel, go ahead.
Oh, I just want, we'll likely have a lot of motions to go over, and could we specify an amount of time? Because I would want to make sure that we have enough time in our next meeting to go through all of those motions and vote on them.
That was also my concern.
Okay. All right. So, I can't type and talk at the same time. So if you want to suggest a time limit, I can type it in here.
How does 20 minutes sound? 15 minutes?
20.
I really don't know how, like, if he could present good information within those minutes, but at the same time, I don't want that to eat over or a process of going over motions.
So I'm hearing 20 minutes. Okay.
And this is just for Q&A in follow-up to his video, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Provide Q&A. Okay. So I've got that in the chat. Ibrahim, are you going to move that?
Yes, I'll move it.
Kevin's got to press the go button and then we can see it. Okay, there we go. Ibrahim has moved the motion to allow Scott McKee to attend this next subcommittee meeting of the Independent Investigation and Prosecution. Oh gosh. To provide Q&A, time limited to 20 minutes. The syntax is a little bit messed up there, isn't it? Okay. Sorry, folks.
We all have to
Okay.
pay a syntax.
I can't paste in text, yeah.
I said we all have
Well,
to pay a syntax. I was just trying to make light of your situation.
that's a horrible pun.
Bad
Horrible
dad
pun.
joke of the night, right?
Yeah. I think the intent is understood. Do we have a second?
I'll second that.
Okay, Ems is second. Ibrahim moves. Ems, how do you vote?
Yes.
Daniel.
Yes.
Ibrahim.
Yes.
Erica.
Yes.
Brian.
Yes.
5-0, that passes. I will contact Scott McKee and see if he's available. We'll have to get the doodle poll date. It'll be kind of a parallel process because we're running out of time.
Yeah. Oh, and Kevin,
But I will yeah.
I'm going to update that current process flowchart based on the feedback I got from Mr. Gissner. So
Okay.
if you could just hold off on that before you send it out. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I'll do that. All right.
So I would like to move that this committee recommend to the entire committee that Scott McKee come to the entire committee.
All right.
I will second that with a comment. And my comment is that even though I like the idea, we're really running out of time. And I don't know if it's feasible to do that.
Right. We basically have 2 more business meetings.
It's important, maybe not feasible, but very important.
Sure.
Right,
Sure.
right.
Okay.
I agree with that. It's very important, but I will, again, I will see what the committee says.
Okay, so we have a motion by Brian and a second by Ems to allow Scott McKee to attend the ad hoc committee to provide Q&A. Any further discussion on that one? Ems, how do you vote?
Yes.
Daniel,
Yes.
Ibrahim,
Yes.
Erica,
Yes.
Brian.
Yes,
All right, that's 5-0. That one passes as well. All right, folks, we are slightly over time. And so I would say that we adjourn this meeting. And before we do that, just let me give you my heartfelt thanks and appreciation for your work on this committee. I appreciate the time that you give up during your evenings, and just want you to know that. Thank you to Jeremy for handling all the back room Zoom levers. Much appreciated, folks. Have a good night and be well. All right, we'll see you soon.
thank you. And thank Jeremy for taking time out over your workday to be here and deal with us. Much
All
appreciated.
right. Thank
Good
you.
night,
Have a good one.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good evening. Buenas
Thanks.
noches.